Now, one of the major things that we've done in our studies is to delve into the ancient history of the Brits. Now, in delving into ancient British history, we found a peculiarity. In modern times, it's been regarded as a bogus history. And the reason for it being a bogus history comes out of Oxford and Cambridge and London in England. And the theory was that Troy never existed other than in the mind of Homer. And as Homer wrote a fictitious poem about Troy, Troy was a fictitious place. It had no foundation in fact or truth and was non-existent. Therefore, a history which based itself upon the first king of Britain being Brutus, the great-grandson of Anchises and grandson of Aeneas of Troy, and that the whole of the British nation were originally, or a large part of them were originally Trojan, had to be a false history. As it was a false history based on Homer's fictional epic, therefore you throw out British history. And this actually was done, and you will find books by these supposed scholars from Oxford and elsewhere stating this in the words that I've just stated, that it's a bogus history based on a bogus fiction by Homer, that this is a brutal, primitive race who had no real history of their own, a bunch of savages, and they decided they would claim descent from Troy. Now, how this lunacy could have taken root in the 19th century is perhaps hard to understand. But you've got to realize that in the United Kingdom, the word united doesn't really apply. It's a very fragmented, fratricidal place where all sorts of petty jealousies and major jealousies are consistently to the fore in the relations between the Scots, the Irish, and the Welsh and the English. Everybody seeks primacy and jealously attacks and niggles at the others. So what you start with in British history is a situation that the history is thoroughly derided before William the Conqueror. And this is the well-known phrase in Britain of, it all began in 1066. In other words, you couldn't believe anything that happened before 1066. Now this leads to a peculiar situation. You get modern professors, and I've read a book recently, I've read several, but one last year, where a professor of archaeology actually states, we know nothing of British history whatsoever other than the snippets and small comments made by various Greek and Roman writers. Now that is an inconceivably stupid statement. You could equally say we know nothing of what the Jews, or the history of the Jews, other than what Roman or Greek writers said about the Jews. In other words, you know nothing of the Jews. Now you know about the Jews because you know of the various histories and documents preserved by the Jews. The Bible, the Talmud, Flavius Josephus, and so on. And we don't say to the Jews, you have no history, because the Greeks and the Romans didn't mention you. And we don't go to China and say to the Chinese, you have no history, because the Greeks and Romans didn't write about you, nor do we do it to the Japanese. Each nation preserves its own history. And really, if you dig up in ancient Assyria and you find the monuments of Assyria with their inscriptions and the libraries of the various kings on cuneiform clay tablets, you are reading the self-preserved histories of Assyria, and the same in Chaldean Babylonia. So why Britain should be singled out and put into a bracket where we are told you cannot have original British records and British inscribed stones of antiquity, British coins and British artifacts, the whole archaeology of Britain and history of Britain, unless it's verified by some Roman or Greek who did not visit the country and who wrote, say, 300 to 500 years after the events he's describing. Very difficult to understand. So it's a double standard which has come in, and it's come in through petty political jealousies and political motivations in the United Kingdom. So what was happening when this Trojan epic had to be abandoned in Britain was that it was in the early 1800s, beginning of the 19th century. You just had the American Revolution, or War of Independence, tearing itself away from the Brits. On the British throne was a very unpopular German monarchy. George III was stark raving mad, although they tried to portray him otherwise. He had six fat debauched sons whose performance around London with loose women and morganatic marriages and gross behaviour was very unpopular. whole damn monarchy was in disrepute. The ruling elite, ruling class needed a puppet monarchy. They were still smarting under the effect of the Jacobite rebellion, where Bonnie Prince Charlie attempted to oust these Hanoverians in the 1745-1750 era. The French had risen on their hind legs and finally got rid of the aristocracy, and they got rid of the king, and there were guillotines everywhere. And it was in this frantic environment in Britain that the decision was taken to get rid of past British history, because it was very necessary to create a bogus history and to eliminate anything that was a threat to the regime and the monarchy. And you've got to realize also that 50% of the British population are estimated to have supported the French Revolution, and at least 50%, if not more, were fully in support of the American Revolution. And this probably is not realized outside the UK. So one of the targets was to abandon the ancient history of the country and to create a history that would shore up the monarchy and protect the establishment. So having gone into that in that way, the details can be researched by anybody. In particular, there was an assault upon the Welsh, because it was in Wales that the histories were mainly preserved. The Welsh had been in their territories for 3,600 years, and they said very firmly, as did many of the Brits in England, that they were people of two migrations. One, a vast migration by sea from Syria, about 1600 years BC, coming from, presumably from from Diocletian, who turns out to be Dungi of and the second migration about 500 BC from a Trojan remnant in the western Asia Minor area, Phrygian Troja. And so we had two migrations, one 3,600 years ago, one 2,500 years ago, coming into the UK, bringing these influences from that area. These histories were forthwith abandoned, purely on the basis that Troy never existed. Well, about 130 years after they abandoned the Albion legend, the coming of Alvine from Syria, Leonard Woolley dug up Ur of the Chaldees, and he dug up the royal necropolis. In digging up the royal necropolis, he dug up the vast tombs of the emperors of Ur. And one of them is of interest to us in that it's the greatest of the emperors, who they think is of the third dynasty, named Dungi, who appears to be the British Diocletian. The interesting thing is that in the British record, written on manuscripts certainly 1,000 years old, the idea was that Diocletian ruled 33 other nations. He also made his daughters rulers of nations or territories. And he had a great enemy named Labana. When Woolley dug up Ur, he found the votive area of Diocletian, and he also found that Diocletian, or Dungi, ruled 33 other countries. He made some of his daughters rulers of countries, and he had a great enemy named Labana. Labana turns out to be the first king of the Hittites, emperor of the Hittites up in Anatolian Turkey, who did actually attack the Chaldean Euphrates civilization and recorded it. Every subsequent king of the Hittites took the throne name of Labana, in the same way as the Caesars in Rome became Caesar after Julius Caesar. In other words, Caesar became a titular name as was a personal name. Everybody used it. Not until around 1880 was the Hittite Empire rediscovered, and so nobody in Europe would have known anything about Labana, yet the British knew all about Labana 1,000 years ago. Yet the British knew all about Labana 1,000 years ago. When Woolley dug up the votive area in the tomb of Dungi, he found metal tables. On the metal tables, he found that there were certain items, reclining models of rams, reclining models of bulls, standing lambs, round balls. When they dug up the Lexden Mound in Cambridgeshire in England, said to be the tomb of King Kinbelin, within the Lexden Mound, they found a metal table in the votive area, reclining bulls, reclining model rams, reclining and standing lambs, and round balls again. In other words, a complete identical paraphernalia in the religious area. All these items are still in the Colchester Museum. But it seems not to have occurred to anybody to make the comparison. So there is some truth in the first legend, and you can take it further. You can compare the ancient measurements, jurisprudence, pottery, and in Britain, at the time of this invasion, 1600 BC, a marvellous metalworking culture burst out from nowhere. It had no antecedents, it had no precedents, there was no way that it could be traced back to a sort of development. It just came out of nowhere. And it's not unlikely that this metalworking culture, known as the Wessex culture, is a direct emanation of this invasion from Ur of the Chaldees. And if you begin to compare some of the marvellous gold and other bronze finds that they've made in ancient mounds and so on in Britain, if you make the comparison with ancient Syrian Ur of the Chaldees, you will see that there is remarkable similarities. So you have an imported culture, an imported civilization, imported technology, in the same thing that's happened to the United States in the last 200 years, or more. Taking this a stage further, if there appears to be some basic truth in the Syrian migration, you also have mentions that in the Odyssey, said again to be by Homer, but I doubt it, where Ulysses talks to a man who says that his homeland is a great island in the Western Ocean beyond the Pillars of Hercules, Gibraltar, which can only be Britain, and he calls it Syri. The name Syri still endures in Britain. It's Surrey, a large county on the south bank of the Thames, and London stands on most of it. You have mentions in old documents, Quranic of Lancarvan, describing people in the Midlands of England and speaking of the territories of the Ealda Sacenas in 1156. The old Syrians is what it sounded like. So the idea that the old Syrians came to Britain was well established and well remembered. In Ur they were known as the Gutians, G-U-T-I-A-N-S. When Brutus came to Britain, the people who were recorded as being there were called Geontes, exactly the same name of the people who were found in the Canary Isles, Geontes. Later they became the Gewissai, and in medieval manuscripts, Anglo-Saxon chronicles and so on, they're the Gewissai. And it's fairly clear that the Gutians, the Geontes, are the Gewissai. And later they dropped the G-E and called them the Wissai, or Wessex people, and said, Wessex, West Saxons, isn't that beautiful? Complete misnomer and another part of the general political ploy to get rid of the history. They actually have translated the Geontes of Britain as being giants, as if there was a mythical giant race there, great big people, and another attempt to create a myth out of fact. So, having dealt with them, we then thought it wise to possibly look at the Brutus legend. Now, the Brutus legend is firmly embedded in Britain, and you have to realize that the main line of kings of Britain always claims in history descent from Brutus. And it doesn't matter if you could claim descent from the Holy Family or Jesus Christ or whatever, you have to be able to claim descent from Brutus to be king. There's no doubt about this. So Brutus had to be got rid of, on the Trojan War being a fiction and the city of Troy being a fiction. Brutus is a fiction. We decided that as the history was proving out in a number of other fields, we were getting all manner of evidence to prove it correct, and reliable history and honourable history, honestly recorded in detail, that it was worth looking at the alphabet of the people. Now, in the same way as the Greeks have an alphabet, the Arabs have an alphabet which is different, and the Egyptians had a picture alphabet, and the Chinese have a pictorial alphabet, hieroglyphics in Egypt. So we also have a peculiar alphabet peculiar to the British. You think it's peculiar to the British at first sight. Again, this alphabet has been thoroughly derided, and they have called the alphabet a forgery, a fake, and a fiction invented by a man named Edward Williams around 1800. Difficult to see that because it's in a manuscript in the Bodleian Library in Oxford which dates around 1520. Difficult to see because it also is mentioned in a book being written for and on behalf of the Prince of Wales in 1794, and the author states, this alphabet I find in a very ancient manuscript in the Bodleian Library. Equally difficult as David ap Gwilym, probably the best of the Welsh poets, is describing the alphabet in his poems in 1370. Another poet, YHW.H.WHY, is describing the alphabet in 1425 roughly. And a further poet is describing the alphabet, Gutter Glyn, in roughly 1450. Equally, it's well known that the alphabet was brought back into use to send messages on sticks around 1400 when Owain Glyndŵr, the Welsh prince, was fighting Henry IV of England. It goes on and on. There is a satirical poem in existence written by a man named Rhys Cain. And Rhys Cain was from Oswestry, and he went to an Eisteddfod in 1580, met a Welsh bard from Glamorgan who had a pipe in it. In other words, a frame of wood with wooden slats in it, upon which was cut with a knife the straight strokes of the Colburn alphabet and a story. And Rhys Cain kindly wrote a satirical mocking poem about the alphabet. Fine. We also find that in 1946 at Nag Hammadi in Egypt, Chenaboscian it's called, a peasant named Muhammad Ali was looking for firewood, and he found a 5-foot clay jar, 5 foot tall, in an old cemetery. He dragged the jar out, took it home, or broke it and one thing the other. Inside were 14 leather satchels. In the 14 leather satchels were 128 Gnostic books, a complete Gnostic library of the Gnostic Christian Church. Now, for 1500 years, people have only really known about the Gnostics, what their enemies, the Church of Rome, chose to write about them, and it's not very polite. But here was an intact Gnostic library. In amongst these 128 books is the book of Masanes, which means laid flat, raw, and a wonder. It means an alphabet, it's not a name of a person. And this gives a complete, detailed description of the Colburn British alphabet, how it is, what it is, and how it works. Same descriptions were published roughly the same, well, almost exactly the same in 1840 in Wales. So we have signs that the alphabet would work. Now, if we look at the Brutus legend, we have this. The British finally come from Western Turkey, Troy, to Britain under Brutus. They pick up people on the way. In other words, they stop at Spain, the Iberian Peninsula, pick up more of their countrymen from Troy and proceed to Britain. So you can possibly link a common alphabet in Britain, Iberic Spain, and Troy. We also know that shortly before the British came from Troy, the Etruscans moved out. And they moved out around 650, 600 BC. And from the same area, Phrygia, in Trojan areas of Turkey. So we have another possible link between Turkey, the Etrurian Empire, which lasted 650 to 100 BC in Italy, and again in Rhaetia, which was BC in Italy, and again in Rhaetia, which is now part of Switzerland, because Pliny the Elder kindly tells us the Rhaetians were Etruscans. What we did then was to identify that the alphabets in all these areas anciently were very similar. You could say near identical. We were encouraged to do this because a man named John Williams in 1846 wrote a book, and in his book he exhibited the ancient Colburn British alphabet, and in exhibiting it he gave the cipher. In other words, what's an A, what's a B, what's a C. And he also said, isn't it strange that the British alphabet is almost identical with Etruscan and with Pelasgian on the coast of Turkey? Well, it's not strange at all if that's where we ancestrally come from, and if that's where the Etruscans come from, and we are roughly kinsmen. There is a tie-up in that Llewellyn Sion of Glamorgan in 1560 preserved the alphabet and preserved its cipher. In other words, he wrote down which sign is A, which is B, which is C, which is D, right through. He also wrote down which signs were numerals, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And so we have an alphabet and we know the lettering. If we know the lettering, obviously if we see a series of signs, we put the appropriate letters underneath, out will pop a word. That word will be in Cymric, in Welsh, and we should be able to translate it into English or French or German or any other language for people to read. If we look at the name of the people, it becomes more interesting. The proper name of the people you would know as Welsh is Cymru. In the modern 20th century, it's popular to use the word C, but the correct spelling is K-H-U-M-R-Y. In ancient Turkey, they were known by the Greeks as the Cimmeroi, C-I-M-M-E-R-O-I, right? They were known by Herodotus, writing in around 460 BC, as the Cimmerians. They moved out of Iraq and Iran, northern areas, out of Assyria, I think when Sennacherib was murdered by one of his sons, and civil war erupted in the Assyrian Empire. The records of the Assyrian emperors dug up at Nineveh and taken to the British Museum, 25,000 clay tablets, exhibit these very same people as the Cymru, K-H-U-M-R-Y, exactly the spelling and name that they have in Britain. The Assyrian emperors got these people from a place we would know as Israel, and they would appear to be the 10 tribes. So there is a clear linkage of people right the way back. We decided that we would attempt to translate the ancient stones in Britain, which are known to be of the year 200 AD in one instance. Those in Aberdeen and Angus in Scotland are known to be 6th century. There are stones in Galloway, said to be 6th century. There are stones in Cumbria, northwest England, again of the same era. There's stones dug up in St Paul's Churchyard in London, known to Dark Age. And there are a number of stones in Wales and a number of church fonts. One of them is an ancient oak font. It's made from the stump of an oak tree, carved into a font, and an inscription around the thing. It actually names Arthfail, who is the Welsh spelling of Arthur. Very interesting. So we've got a number of stones all over the place. We simply applied the alphabet to these stones. In other words, that sign is A, that's B, that's C, or whatever. We then had, under the list of signs, we had a list of modern letters. Those modern letters formed words, and we were able to read what the stones say. So a stone put up in Nevin in West Wales around 950 turns out to be inscribed with the name of Higuel Rex, and in all the manuscripts Higuel Rex is Howell the Good, who ruled the area and died in 948, and if the stone's put up around 950, that's right. The ruins of his court under Upper Court Farm and Lower Court Farm are about 6 to 8 miles away, and about, I think, 6 miles away is Crug Howell, the heap of Howell, his grave mound. So he fits. We found another stone in Wales, interesting one. It said Godufan the Exile. Godufan is a bit of a mouthful of a name, hardly inventable. And we find around 200 AD a British king named Godufan was indeed deposed. It says in the records, Godufan was a turbulent, mad and wild king, for which reason he was deposed, exiled, and his brother Hrun placed in his stead. And it goes on right through Britain. You can translate all the stones with correct meaning, and naming people and giving a little more historical detail elsewhere. This encouraged us to tackle Etruscan inscriptions. So we looked for Etruscan inscriptions. Now you'll find in Britain a lot of books, not many about Etruria. It's not popular in Britain, presumably it's considered to be Italian. So whilst the Romans are much publicised, the Italians aren't, or the Etruscans aren't. And we found great volumes of Etruscan pictures of statues and ruined buildings and tomb mounds, but it was very hard to get at inscriptions. When we started to get to them, we found that they were little ones on wine bottles, on bronze mirrors, which were carved with scenes, with statements, on the sides of statues, all sorts of minor artifacts that people would use would have inscriptions on them. We were able to translate these without any difficulty whatsoever. And what we did note, and it's unmistakable, that some of these, particularly on, say, wine bottles, are pithy little humorous statements. And they unmistakably have the dry humour and the dry sort of self-depreciating wit that we associate with Jewish people. There's no doubt about this. And we therefore went further. We looked at, there's one very famous inscription. They found a tomb of a princess or great noble lady in one of the Etruscan cemeteries, untouched, and they found within this tomb a large amount of silver tableware, It's virtually an ancient tea set or dining set in silver. And this has been translated, if you can use the word translated, to mean Lathia. And they then said, aha, Lathia is the woman who owns this stuff, you see? And they even gave it a second name. And what they're doing is taking the Etruscan letter, finding the nearest Greek letter that matches it, and then reading it in Latin. Although Pliny and a number of other writers tell them time and time and time again that the Etruscan language is nothing whatsoever remotely like Latin or Greek. And though they're told this, they can't resist doing something about it. In other words, the academic can never say, I don't know. And he feels he's writing to an uninformed audience who don't know either, and he can get away with it. So we translated this Lathia stuff. It was very interesting because it actually says the gift to lie silent in the tomb, and words to that effect. And it doesn't say Lathia at all. And realizing we were onto a winner, we translated a lot of the major Etruscan texts. We translated the Perugia Kipos, a large stone slab with like a great gravestone with 36 lines of detailed writing on it, and it tells how 12 clan or tribal units of a people are setting up a union, and in this unified state they will divide the land equally amongst themselves. They will cooperate to drain the land, to irrigate it, to fertilize it, to clear the swamps, the woods, and to make it productive, and they will not war with each other, they will attempt to cooperate. It's, I don't know, like a constitution in a sense. We then translated other major statements. We found the 3 gold tablets that were known as the Purgi tablets from a temple at the port of Carrere. That's the Welsh way of pronouncing it. It was the ancient Etruscan port near Rome, major city area with 3 ports. And these little gold tablets, one's in Carthaginian and 2 are in Etruscan. They've not been read. We're able to find that they tell of the league of the Etruscans and Carthaginians to provide 60 warships each to combined fleet to attack the Greek, to provide 60 warships each to combined fleet to attack the Greek Phocaean pirates who'd settled on the Isle of Sardinia and to get rid of them. The Greeks had been driven out or opted out from Turkey on the shores of there, and they'd come away when Cyrus had become Emperor of Persia, sent his general Harpagus there, and they had decided to set up in Sardinia and to make a living robbing the merchant fleets of the Carthaginians and the Etruscans. And it's well known that this league was formed. The whole story is well recorded by ancient authors, and here we have it repeated on the Purgi tablets, so we know that we're into authentic history. The other major text we deciphered in Etruria was the Agnome tablet in the British Museum, a large bronze tablet, 26 lines of writing on one side, a lesser amount on the other side, and it tells who the Etruscans were and where they came from before they got to Etruria. And I think therefore it's a very important tablet. It says that they were in a country happily. There was huge pestilence and plague and all sorts of cosmic disasters. They were led out of this country and they went with the little cabinet in a cart, and they follow this little cabinet which is in a cart. And they finally arrive at another land where it is their own land and it's given to them, and they settle there and live there. I'm obviously paraphrasing what it says. And later on the other side it says how they are forcibly removed and ejected from this land of their own, and they are taken to another place which they don't like. And again they follow the little cabinet in the cart, and the little cart was presumably drawn by oxen or donkeys or something. And off goes the little cart and they follow it. And they come to a place and they take ship, and in ships they come to Etruria. It appears the Cymry are moving off from northern Assyria through Asia Minor, coming to the Dardanelles. They take ship and they go round to Etruria. That's what it appears to be telling us. And obviously the earlier side, the other side, would appear to be that they're in Egypt, and there's the cataclysms in Egypt at the time of Moses. They're led out by Moses. They follow the little ark in the cabinet, whatever it is in the cart, and off they go to their own land, their promised land. So I think it's probably one of the most important documents we've read so far. Now, having got that far, we then said, well, what have they got in Phrygian, areas in Turkey? And we found one very long inscription straight away, much publicized, and it's over the top of a building, which looks like a temple to us, and it is described actually as the tomb of Midas. And when we looked at this long inscription, runs right over the top and right down the side, it reads out perfectly into Cymric again. And there's no doubt whatsoever about it. Now, whether the inscription was added to an existing temple building, or whether it was put up by the builders of the building, is another matter. There's no doubt whatsoever it's a form of harp's prayer. And it's very unlikely that that's a tomb. It's probably a temple building. So we were now in a position of translating all the ancient British stones. We were in a position of translating any Etruscan inscription we come across or we wish to translate and getting sense. We turned to Rhaetia, where certain small inscriptions have been preserved, and we mopped them up in no time. They also translate into Cymric, and we know from Pliny that the Rhaetians in Switzerland are Etruscans who moved north. So we've got a constant fit in the same way as there was devastation in the world tomorrow, and New Zealand was the only place that escaped. It's quite possible that in later years New Zealanders would drift into ravaged America and would find documents that they could read in their own language, their own tongue, and the same in Canada, and they'd finally work their way back to the UK and read what was left there. And this is all we're doing. We're doing what Alex Haley did in a much more, we're not quite in the family genre that he's in, we're into a national sort of situation, but we're following our national roots right the way back as far as we can. Interestingly, the Welsh have always said that their language is the language of the angels, and the language and alphabet is the language of heaven. Now, they say that in those words. And here we have it called the language of the angels and the language of heaven in the Nag Hammadi scrolls in the Gnostic library. That's precisely the same definition they give of the same alphabet. It's the language of God, the language of heaven. So we had now accomplished that which pleased us, because really we were verifying the basic and fundamental accuracy of British history as we know it, and as it has been flung aside and derided. And you've got to realise that the average Englishman has been persuaded that he's an Anglo-Saxon, and therefore anything before 500 AD doesn't apply to him and is to be booted out and got rid, in the same way as the Americans came here and got rid of the Indian culture and history. But the thing is, you'd think that they'd have learned something. Over there they've been there longer. Actually, very few English people are Angles or Saxons, and the phrases that I hear used, like an Anglo-American agreement, are just absurd. It's like saying a British Minnesota agreement for the USA. Very few people in Britain are Angles. What you're saying is you've got an agreement with the county of Northumberland. It's a complete absurd piece of nomenclature. Tiny numbers of them were Saxons on the coasts of Kent and around Sussex and Dorset, around there, the Isle of Wight. And certainly the bulk of the population is ancient Gutian, it's Vandal Mercian, it's British, and it's picked in the British from the Brutus people of Troy, the Trojans, the Cymry, and from the Styrians. And the idea that they're Angles and Saxons is just the daftest thing you'll ever hear. But they've been persuaded that they are. And the strange thing is this: the Welsh, in the persons of the Cymry, attacked northern France, as is well known. They attacked Europe, the British, in 383. And the two major principalities that endured were Brittany, still does, and Llydaw. Llydaw became Normandy in 852, when the Normans were aided by the French king to attack the place and install Roland and Northganger. But a Welshman can go over and speak Welsh to Bretons today, and in a very short time they're understanding each other. And a Breton can come to Wales and he can speak to the Welsh and understand each other. But it's very strange that no Angle and no Saxon, as we call them, no Englishman, can go to Germany and speak to Germans, and they never could. So there's got to be something wrong. Now, Welsh records of 826 say very clearly that the language which prevailed in England and became the national language is the language of the Isinglas. It's the language of the Iceni. the Iceni, the great big tribe, who were led by a tribal nation led by Boudicca in her attack upon the Romans at the time of Nero. So this is the language of England, not Anglo and not Saxon. And then you've got a question, is it Anglo or is it Saxon? You can't have Anglo-Saxon. It's like saying we've got French Yugoslavian. What is it? And it's neither. So we have a number of fictions in this wonderful home of tradition in England.